So good evening, evening in the UK. I know that people are joining us from a number of different countries, so good morning or good night, whatever works for you. My name's Helen Paynter. I'm Director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third session of our conference, From the Rising to the Setting Sun, Global Perspectives on Bible and Violence. The Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence exists for two purposes, well, two subject areas, interpretation of biblical violence and use and abuse of the Bible in a violent world. And this evening's focus will be on the first of those. We look to facilitate research and conversation in these areas, but always with the intention of trickling it down to the church ultimately. However, tonight is the academic end of things, and very delighted to about the speakers that we have lined up. I'm not going to say too much more. I'm going to introduce Dr. Trevor Lawrence, who's going to be moderating or chairing the session today. Trevor's one of our research associates, has been associated with us since the very beginning, almost the very beginning anyway. And he's now director of the Cataclesia Institute, which I recommend that you look up. It's a fantastic organisation that aims to cultivate the theological imagination. And I'm thrilled to welcome, Trevor will introduce them properly later, but I'm thrilled to welcome our speakers today, Dr. Richard Middleton, Brandon Hurlbert, Jennifer Lehmann, and John Darby. So thank you all, and very much looking forward to your contributions. If you are a Twitter user, be delighted if you would live tweet the event, if that works for you without distracting you too much. And I'm going to put the Twitter handle into the chat right now. So if you would use that, that would be great. Thank you. And those who've attended any of our events before will know that we always start in a particular way. We're very aware of the fact that we talk and think about violence on a daily basis. And this isn't simply an academic issue. Violence is always something that has somebody on the sharp end of it. And so we like to begin by acknowledging victims of violence, present and past, by remembering them, and just by positioning ourselves in that way before them. And we do that simply by me lighting a candle, and we'll observe just a few moments of silence, and then the and then the candle will continue to burn during our and then the candle will continue to burn during our meeting. Over to you, Trevor.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thank you to everyone for being with us today. Welcome to what is now our third session of this week's conference of the Center for the Study of Bible and Violence. As Helen said, my name is Trevor Lawrence, and I'm privileged to be a research associate with the CSBV. As part of the larger work of this conference, our session today is devoted to research that utilizes traditional biblical hermeneutical approaches to violence in the Bible. What we mean by that is in the text or behind the text approaches to the violence that we see in the Bible. As a word about our structure today, we are going to have 4 presenters. Each presenter will have an allotted amount of time, and once all of our papers have been presented, we'll then have about 30 minutes at the conclusion of our session that will be devoted to questions for our panel of speakers and discussion about their work. As a friendly note on the front end, in these 4 papers, we're going to be examining several difficult texts that cover a variety of forms of violence, forms that some of us here may actually have personal experience with. So I'll encourage everyone that's listening to exercise appropriate care as we venture into these explorations together. We're thrilled to have as our keynote speaker for this session, Dr. J. Richard Middleton. Dr. Middleton is Professor of Biblical Worldview and Exegesis at Northeastern Seminary at Roberts Wesleyan College in Rochester, New York. Among Dr. Middleton's numerous distinguished publications are The Liberating Image, the Imago Dei in Genesis 1, and A New Heaven and a New Earth, Reclaiming Biblical Eschatology. His paper today for us is entitled, Did Abraham Pass the Test? Unbinding the Aqedah from the Straitjacket of Tradition. Dr. Middleton, the floor is yours.
Let me know if you can see this screen now. Okay, good. I never used to be troubled by the narrative of Abraham's test in Genesis 22, known in Jewish tradition as the Aqedah, if you're a Sephardi, or the Aqedah, if you're Ashkenazi. It's called the binding of Isaac, Aqedat Yitzhak. Like most Christians and Jews, and like many academic theologians and biblical scholars, I simply accepted Abraham's response to God as a model of faithful obedience. In recent times, more and more theologians and biblical scholars, both Jewish and Christian, have admitted an unease with what seems to be Abraham's blind obedience to God, an obedience that includes being willing to kill his very own son. And those who let their uneasiness guide their interpretation of Genesis 22 have often believed they were reading against the grain of the text, exercising a hermeneutic of suspicion, protesting what they assume the text clearly teaches, namely Abraham as a positive model of faithfulness to God. Now, I myself have come to reconsider the meaning of Genesis 22, specifically whether we should valorize Abraham's response to God. My initial suspicions were based on my own experience of God and my reflections on what I would do if I were, quote unquote, tested in this way. If I ever heard a voice, internal or external, telling me to sacrifice my son to prove my faithfulness to God, I certainly would not, at least not immediately and without further deliberation, comply, as Abraham seems to have. Minimally, I'd question this voice. There is significant biblical precedent not to acquiesce voicelessly in a situation you think is wrong or unjust. The canonical witness of Scripture, including the lament Psalms, Moses' vigorous arguing with God at the golden calf, Job's extensive protest about his suffering, the complaints of the prophets Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and others, Jesus' own prayers in the garden as he anticipates his death and then again on the cross. In all of these ways, canonical Scripture provides normative precedent for speaking out directly to God, challenging God over what you perceive as wrong in your life or in the world around you. Just 4 chapters before the Aqedah, in Genesis 18, Abraham does exactly that. There we find an extended dialogue between Abraham and God, in which Abraham questions whether it is right for God to destroy Sodom if there are righteous people living there. I'm going to come back to Genesis 18, but here I want to note a contrast between Abraham's active and passionate intercession in Genesis 18 over the fate of Sodom and his potential silence in Genesis 22 over the fate of his own son and his own role in that fate. Why couldn't Abraham have spoken up in Genesis 22 and said, like he did earlier, "Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right?" Or as Job did, "Far be it from me to say you are right. Until I die, I will not put away my integrity." Or as Jesus said, "Take this cup from me." Or maybe, quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you abandoned me?" So in this paper, I'm going to join the chorus of contemporary voices who propose a critical reading of the Aqedah. However, I'm going to account for my skepticism about Abraham in Genesis 22 on internal, inner biblical grounds, the world within the text. I want to do exegesis, not ideological criticism. Or to use Jewish terminology, I want to propose a Peshat reading of the text rather than a Midrashic reading. This paper is part of a larger project. My Indian just working, try that, yeah. part of a larger project, a book I've just completed called Abraham's Silence, which examines the Aqedah in light of biblical models of vigorous prayer, with chapters on the lament psalms, the intercessory prayers of Moses and the prophets, and the protests of Job. This book has 3 chapters on the Aqedah, but I'm going to present only the core of my argument, and a compressed core at that, for why I think Abraham did not pass the test. This is going to require an alternative proposal of what is being tested, which means we need to turn to a contextual reading of the Aqedah, a reading in light of the broader Abraham story. And let me just ask you now, are you seeing my entire screen properly? No, you're not. Look at that. I didn't have it right. Now it's larger. Okay, you can see it better. Suddenly it just struck me. Okay. So one common way of reading the Abraham story is to follow the narrative arc of promise, delay, and fulfillment, especially the promise concerning Abraham's descendants, through whom his line would continue, by whom the nations would bless themselves or bless each other. This narrative arc moves through various articulations of the promise. Then Sarah's barrenness, then the attempt to produce a son through Hagar, then God's specification that the heir will come through Sarah, followed by a prediction that this would all happen quite shortly. And finally, in chapter 21, the birth of Isaac. Now, the narrative arc of the Abraham story, as an arc about the promised son, reaches its culmination in Genesis 21, which is prior to the Aqedah. This raises the question of why we need the story of Genesis 21. What exactly is the function of the Aqedah in the larger Abraham story? The traditional interpretation, which I respect, but respectfully challenge, is that Abraham is being tested for his willingness to give up the child of promise, the very one through whom future blessing would come. It's a test, in other words, of Abraham's wholehearted commitment to God, placing this commitment above every earthly value, even God's promise of an heir. And here we may compare the 2 parallel leave-takings to which Abraham is called, linked by the repetition of Lech Lecha, possibly rendered as go yourself. In Genesis 12:1, Abraham is called to leave his family and his home, while in 22:2, he's called to sacrifice his son. In one case, he's called to make a break with his past. In the second case, he's called to relinquish his future. So this reading certainly has prima facie plausibility. When Israel was tested in the wilderness in Exodus and Numbers, this was to prove their trust in God. And prove here has the sense of bringing out and realizing a potential, prove in practice. The potential could be there, but it might be latent. And the stringent situation of testing can force the one being tested to rise to the occasion, show their mettle, so to speak. So, is Abraham being tested to see if he would be willing to give up his son and his future out of commitment to God? Now, the first problem with this interpretation is ethical. The commitment to God that Abraham has to demonstrate here involves being willing to kill his very own son. How can that be a model of commitment to God? It works only as a model if we abstract from the very particularity of the text to some general axiom about the need for wholehearted obedience to God, an axiom that's obvious from elsewhere in Scripture, and we didn't need this text to ground it. So there's an ethical problem. But there's another problem, an exegetical problem. The problem is that it's unclear why this test is needed at all, because the Abraham story gives absolutely no evidence of Abraham's special attachment to Isaac, such that giving him up would prove his commitment to God. Abraham would seem rather attached to Ishmael, which is very clear from chapters 17 and 21. When God tells Abraham that Isaac, not Ishmael, is the one through whom the covenant will be passed, this leads to Abraham's pleading with God not to forget Ishmael. He exclaims, "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight." When Sarah wants him to send Hagar and Ishmael away, in chapter 21, we're told the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son, that's his son Ishmael. In fact, the account of what happens in Genesis 20 suggests that Abraham is so attached to Ishmael, he simply doesn't care about the replacement son that is promised. Abraham had passed Sarah off as his sister in Egypt back in chapter 12. The result was that the Pharaoh took her into his harem. Abraham does this again in chapter 20, this time with the king of Gerar, who takes her into his harem. But this comes after God predicted that there would be a covenant son born, and after God predicted it would happen soon, presumably in the next year. Yet knowing this, Abraham goes ahead and passes off Sarah as his sister a second time, not caring that he might lose her and the promised heir with her. Indeed, she might even be pregnant at the time. So I don't think it's clear that Abraham is attached to Isaac. Could it be that Abraham is being given a chance in chapter 22 to prove his love for Isaac? After all, God's instructions to Abraham contains the following description of Isaac. Your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. So maybe Abraham's love for Isaac is being tested, or at least that might be part of the test. Abraham's love for Isaac is not actually stated as a fact by the narrator, as is typically assumed by commentators. It occurs in what is effectively a parenthetical description of Isaac in God's instructions to Abraham. We could take the phrase, whom you love, to have the rhetorical force, not of a declarative statement of fact, but rather of suggesting to Abraham that he loves Isaac, or attempting to evoke his love for Isaac with the sense of, you love him, don't you? So prove it by your response to the test. Could it be that Abraham's actions are meant to reveal whether or not he loves Isaac? But what would be evidence of this love? I suggest that Abraham could prove his love for Isaac by speaking out and protesting God's command to sacrifice him. Speaking out on behalf of Isaac might even extend and deepen an incipient love that he might have for his son, because testing often brings to the surface and makes actual what's only potential. Why this interpretation occurred to me was because as I read further, I found that the phrase, your son, your only son, is repeated by the angel of Yahweh in verses 12 and 16, but we do not find a repetition of whom you love. These verses affirm Abraham's fear of God and obedience to the divine word, but he has not withheld his son, his only one. Given that he's just attempted to sacrifice Isaac, it makes sense that this God-fearing obedience would not qualify as love for Isaac. So the phrase is omitted. So I think we need to rethink what Yahweh means when he says through the angel, now I know you're a God-fearer, since you've not withheld your son, your only one, from me. The statement describes what was discovered through the testing, but it is a logical fallacy to infer that was the purpose of the test if we have reason to believe otherwise. A professor may say to a student after a test, now I know that you are a C student. But that doesn't mean that was the purpose of the test. The professor was hoping the student would put some effort into it and get an A. With this in mind, I'm going to suggest that Abraham was not being tested for his unquestioning obedience. That's not something that God wants, but rather he was being tested for his discernment of God's character. I agree that he's being tested for his trust in God, but genuine trust is not equivalent to blind faith to do anything a voice from heaven tells you. Trust in God requires knowledge or discernment of the sort of God this is. And here we can note that beside the narrative arc of the promise of descendants, which culminates in the birth of Isaac in chapter 21, there's another narrative arc discernible in the Abraham story. This is the arc of Abraham's growing relationship with God. It's a very important narrative arc since the Abraham story is about the genesis of a new relationship formalized as a covenant in chapters 15 and 17 between a God whom later scripture will distinguish radically from the deities of the nations and a man with no explicit prior knowledge of this God, contrary to a whole bunch of rabbinic midrash. So let's attend to Abraham's developing relationship with God in Genesis. Taking as our cue the 7 divine speeches addressed to Abraham between Genesis 12 and 22, God never speaks to Abraham again after that. We may note the ups and downs of Abraham's verbal responses on each occasion. These responses exhibit a growing and then a declining degree of intimacy and confidence in the divine-human relationship. Although God speaks to Abraham on 2 occasions in chapter 12 and once in chapter 13, the first time any verbal response from Abraham is recorded is chapter 15. In that chapter, God speaks multiple times about the promise of an heir and the promise of land, and Abraham responds in both cases with questions, honestly expressing his doubts. And in both cases, God takes his questions seriously and responds appropriately to bolster Abraham's faith. God speaks again in chapter 17 about the covenant and circumcision, and also about the birth of Isaac through Sarah. In all this, Abraham speaks only once, asking God not to forget about Ishmael, which God agrees to, while reiterating the promise about Isaac. At the beginning of chapter 18, when three men visit Abraham and Sarah, there is some recorded speech from Yahweh, distinguished as one among the three, concerning Sarah giving birth. No speech of Abraham is reported, but Sarah speaks once in reply to deny she laughed, to which God responds, "Oh yes, you did laugh." Then comes the extended dialogue between God and Abraham in Genesis 18. God reveals his intentions about Sodom to Abraham, which generates Abraham's bold upbraiding of God about doing what's right, followed by God agreeing to spare the city for the sake of 50. Then Abraham speaks 5 more times as he brings the number down, and each time God agrees. Finally, in Genesis 22, Ha-Elohim, not Yahweh, for the first time in any of the speech introductions, God is not introduced as Yahweh, but as Ha-Elohim, God or the deity, addresses Abraham twice at the beginning of the narrative and twice more through an angel from heaven. In all this, Abraham says only one word, Hineni, here I am. Says it twice. Now, what is the nature of this God whom Abraham is coming to know? In all the reported dialogues between Yahweh and Abraham, Yahweh is shown to be a God who listens to his servant and tries to address his articulated needs. And in the case of the rescue of Lot, even his unarticulated needs. So one way to think of this relational narrative arc is that it has to do with Abraham's coming to understand the nature and character of the God who called him out of Haran. And the sign of Abraham's growing or diminishing discernment of God's character is his willingness to speak up in the matter of later psalmists and prophets, articulating his own needs and interceding on behalf of others. This makes sense of the intentional opportunity God provides Abraham in chapter 18 to learn more about divine mercy through the process of intercession, that he might teach his children and his household the way of Yahweh. Here it is worth pausing to understand what's going on in Genesis 18, because this episode sets us up for chapter 22. In Genesis 18, 3 men in Ashim have visited Abraham's camp and predicted that Sarah will have a son. 2 of them, angels, it turns out, depart for Sodom, while the third, who is Yahweh himself, remains, for he has something to tell Abraham. Yahweh muses to himself, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? That is concerning the cry of Sodom that's come to him. Yahweh decides to inform Abraham of this cry, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice. Tzedakah u'mishpat. When God tells Abraham that he's going down to see if the cry he's heard demands judgment, if not, I will know, he says, he waits on Abraham's response. But Abraham overinterprets God's statement that he's going to examine the situation in Sodom to mean God's already decided to destroy the city, where his nephew Lot is living. No doubt his assumption is partly due to the reputation of Sodom, alluded to in Genesis 13 and 14. It's possibly also due to Abraham's assumptions about the character of God and what constitutes God's righteousness and justice. But notice, this is precisely what God wants to teach Abraham by revealing his intentions about Sodom. God wants Abraham to be able to instruct his children and his household in the way of Yahweh, so they will do righteousness and justice. But what this means is that Abraham must first himself be instructed in God's righteous ways. Abraham does indeed intercede on behalf of Sodom, upbraiding God for unjustly planning to destroy the righteous or the innocent, along with the wicked, and encouraging God to do what's right and just. He challenges God despite being, as he puts it, just dust and ashes. In a series of requests that God save the city, initially for the sake of 50 righteous, which he eventually ratchets down to 10 as his last offer, Abraham tests the extent of God's mercy, and God accedes to each request. Contrary to a traditional reading of this passage, there is no bargaining or bartering or haggling going on here, since bartering involves 2 people starting at opposite ends and meeting in the middle. The dialogue in Genesis 18 is different. Abraham makes an opening offer of 50. God says, sure. Abraham says, how about 45? God says, fine. Abraham proposes 40. God agrees. Then Abraham drops the price by 10 instead of 5 and offers 30. God says, let's do it. Abraham offers 20. God agrees. Then Abraham says, I got one final offer. How about 10? God says, 10 it is. Here's my question. What's God trying to teach Abraham about the way of Yahweh from this exchange? If I were selling a used car, and this is my approach, it means I want to give away the car. So just say at the last bit, can I have the car for free? And I say, sure, take it. It's as if Yahweh is looking for an excuse to save Sodom and Lot. Jeremiah 5:1 suggests that God might forestall destruction of a wicked city for just one righteous person. That Abraham stops at 10 suggests he hasn't fully plumbed the depths of divine mercy. He has not yet learned what God wanted to teach him. Nevertheless, God rescues Lot and his family through the angelic agency that he sent, even though Abraham hadn't thought to ask for that outright. At one point during the rescue operation, as Lot was lingering in Sodom, the angels seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. When the angels instruct Lot to flee to the hills, he tells them that he can't make it that far, and so he appeals to their favor or mercy, their chesed, and he requests refuge in an outlying town, simply asking the angels spare the town for his sake, and they agree without discussion. Lot asks on a smaller scale for what Abraham couldn't, and it's immediately granted. So the question is, why couldn't Abraham simply have asked God to spare Sodom for the sake of Lot and his family? That's the unarticulated point behind it. Perhaps he didn't think God was that merciful. So at the end of his dialogue with God in chapter 18, Abraham has not quite learned what God wanted to teach him, even though Lot and his family have been saved. So we may frame the question that wends its way through the Abraham story as follows. How will Abraham be able to distinguish this God he's coming to know from the gods of the nations? This sort of discernment will be necessary if Abraham will be equipped to charge his children and household after him to keep the way of Yahweh, doing righteousness and justice. In light of the command that Abraham receives in Genesis 22 to sacrifice his son, we may even put the question a little more pointedly. Is the God of Abraham simply one of the pagan deities of Mesopotamia or Canaan that requires child sacrifice as a symbol of allegiance? Abraham assumes he is. Or is he different, a God of mercy and love for his children, who is willing to forego judgment even for Sodom for the sake of the righteous? That was something Abraham should have learned, so he could pass it on to his children, but he didn't. The lesson was cut short by Abraham himself. So in a final climactic episode of the Abraham story, God gives Abraham another opportunity to learn and grow in the relationship. But God ups the ante this time. He raises the stakes. It's not his nephew Lot who will be destroyed along with Sodom, his home. It's Abraham's own son. And it's not God who will do it. Abraham must do it by his own hand. If anything would force Abraham to speak out, to appeal to the mercy of God, this would be it, one would think. Abraham has the opportunity in this test to protest the command and intercede for his son's life. That would articulate his view of the character and ways of God, both in what he says to God and in the very fact that he says it. It would further show his love for Isaac, which would be a good thing, not an impediment to his commitment to God. But Abraham doesn't speak out, he's silent. Whereas Abraham became silent at the end of his intercession in chapter 18, in Genesis 22, he never gets the conversation off the ground. And his silence speaks volumes. It articulates a view of God as clearly as if he'd used words. He articulates a view of God as a harsh taskmaster who is not to be challenged. And if that's what Abraham learned about God, we may wonder what he passed on to Isaac. Many commentators through the ages have noted that Isaac is missing at the end of the Aqedah story. In verse 5, Abraham tells his servants that he and the boy will go up the mountain to worship and we will return to you. But the narrator tells us that Abraham returned to his young men, his servants. Isaac is conspicuously absent. And this is a very well-crafted narrative in which every detail matters. In the remainder of the Abraham story, there is no evidence that Abraham and Isaac ever see each other or speak to each other again. When Abraham sends a servant to find a bride for Isaac, it is at a distance. He never personally meets Isaac. When the servant brings Rebekah to Isaac, the text tells us he was living in Beer Laharoi in the Negev, in the southernmost extremity of the land. But Abraham lives in Beersheba, which may not be far away, but it's a different geographical spot. The next time they meet, if we may put it that way, is at his funeral, but that's too late for reconciliation. What about Sarah? She's missing at the start of Genesis 22. She's also missing from Abraham's life for the rest of Genesis after chapter 22. The next time Sarah is mentioned, we're told of her death in Hebron, where she'd been living. But Abraham travels presumably from Beersheba to Hebron to bury her. It doesn't seem they've been living together, at least if we attend to the geographical references in Genesis. Did Abraham's attempt to sacrifice Isaac result in Sarah's alienation? It's more complicated than that, but I don't have time to get into that right now. The fact that Abraham comes down the mountain alone and is never reported as seeing Isaac again prompts me to ask if Abraham's attempt to sacrifice his son without even attempting to stand up for the boy and plead with God for his life didn't have the effect of traumatizing Isaac and alienating him from his father. So if God wants Abraham to instruct his children and household in the way of God for righteousness and justice, we do well to ask, what did Isaac learn from the episode on the mountain? I think we can safely say if Isaac learned anything of the mercy of God, it was through the angel's intervention to stay his father's hand. Ultimately, I think Isaac would be confused, however, about the character of God. And if Abraham's response to God's command affected Isaac negatively, how could we view his response as exemplary? Wouldn't there be some alternative way to be faithful to God without traumatizing and alienating his son? Later, we are told by God's servant, by Abraham's servant, that, and by the narrator in a genealogy, that Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, I think as compensation for what he went through on the mountain. But it's significant that Abraham never blesses Isaac. It was literally impossible to do since they never met again after chapter 22. In fact, we're told that God blessed Isaac after Abraham's death. God, in a sense, tried to make up for Abraham's failing, but was it ever really made up? What would be the effect on Isaac of the estrangement and the result of the lack of direct blessing from his father? Well, one of the most pronounced effects of this episode in the structure of the book of Genesis is this. We're all familiar with the promises given to the three ancestors of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here's just a sampling of texts. That triad is found over and over again within the Bible. But the book of Genesis, after the primeval history, consists of the Abraham story, 12 to 25, the Jacob story, 25 to 35, and the Joseph story, 37 to 50, each introduced by reference to the father of the main character. The introductions all begin with these are the generations, the toldot of, and names the father. Terah for the Abraham story, Isaac for the Jacob story, and Jacob for the Joseph story. But there was no heading, these are the toldot of Abraham, which would introduce a narrative block about Isaac. Isaac has only one chapter that could be considered his own story, in which God blesses him no matter where he goes, as if trying to comfort him for what he went through on the mountain. But apart from that chapter, Isaac is only a bit player in either Abraham's story or Jacob's story. He's got no story of his own. Even in the Jacob story, there's no mention of Isaac between the blessing of Jacob and the notice of Isaac's death. He simply disappears. Isaac has no significant actions that advance the narrative of promise. He is a much diminished, shadowy, and insubstantial character in Genesis, which is perhaps to be expected given what he went through on the mountain. One of the most intriguing bits of information we're given that bears on the question of what Isaac learned is found in Genesis 31. In a covenant that he makes with his uncle Laban, he swears by the fear of Isaac. That is a name that was bequeathed to him from his father about who God is the fear, the pachad. This is what Isaac passed on to Jacob by intent or otherwise. And my contextual reading of the Aqedah story suggests that this use of fear does not have a positive connotation. That God was to be feared was Abraham's legacy to Isaac. So I'm inclined to think that Abraham did not pass a test in Genesis 22. His silent obedience indicated that he did not discern God's merciful character, at least until the angel called off the sacrifice. He did not show love for his son by interceding on his behalf. Yes, he did come to understand that God didn't want to sacrifice his son. And if we consider his sacrificing the ram an analogy with a makeup test given by a generous professor, we might say in this sense, Abraham barely scraped through, but that might be conceding too much. I've only begun to scratch the surface of this topic. I realized I wasn't able to give all the interesting rhetorical signals throughout Genesis 22 that suggest all is not right with God, Abraham, and Isaac in the story, nor did I have time to examine the two angel speeches in detail. These speeches are usually thought to validate Abraham's response to God. I actually have a plausible alternative reading of those speeches, but for that, you're going to have to get my book. Here I need to say that I am not intending to disparage the long history of interpretation that exalts Abraham for his response to God. I respect that tradition. So when I subtitled this paper, Unbinding the Aqedah from the Straitjacket of Tradition, that was not meant to be an insult. In biblical interpretation, no one comes to a text traditionless. Every reader is shaped by a whole series of prior readings and assumptions, and I am no different. It's impossible for me to offer an alternative reading without standing on the shoulders of many others who've already grappled with its meaning and with whose grappling I respect. Yet the question must be asked whether the tradition of prior interpretations, each dependent on their particular historical context and on the assumptions and interests of the interpreters, should act as a straitjacket, preventing new and fresh readings of the text. I believe they should not. So I've attempted to unbind the Aqedah from the limitations of traditional readings. My motivation is that a fresh encounter with this ancient text from a new angle, raising new considerations that might not only illumine its meaning, but renew our experience of God, the God who we believe can be encountered precisely through this text. In conclusion, it's my claim that Abraham could have chosen the more excellent way of protest concerning God's command and intercession about his son. That would have had the salutary result of Abraham exhibiting and growing in his discernment of God's merciful character, and I believe it may have demonstrated and even deepened his love for his only remaining son. How might Isaac have turned out if he witnessed his father pleading on his behalf with God's positive response to Abraham's intercession? Would he have returned down the mountain with Abraham? Would he have bequeathed to Jacob a different notion of God than the fear? And would there be a unit of narrative material, perhaps coming between the Ishmael genealogy and the Jacob story, focused on Isaac's life, beginning with, now these are the Toldot of Abraham? Given the way things turned out, we can only imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Middleton, for that really engaging and intriguing presentation. We've already got comments and questions swirling in our chat. I'll remind everyone that we're going to have a time for questions after all of our presentations. You are, of course, more than welcome to get your thoughts down in the chat box, but at the conclusion of our time, we'll have a half hour together where I'll actually be encouraging you all to present your questions with your own voice to the presenters. So you can look forward to that. Moving right along, our next presenter is Brandon Hurlbert. Brandon is a PhD student at Durham University, and his paper is entitled For Vengeance or Something Else, The Hope of the Timnite Woman in Judges 14. Brandon.
Hello. Hopefully all my things work, but thank you so much for having me. Let me just do a quick test here. Can you all see that? Does that come up for you? I can't tell. You have to say something. Oh, good. Okay, great. Cool. Then I will just technology. There we go. Okay, so expectations are set high. A son will be born, a Nazarite from beginning to end, birth to death, womb to tomb, and he will begin to save Israel from the hands of their oppressors. We are told that the boy grew, the Lord blessed, and the Spirit was upon him. What a great way to start off the story. For many, the vengeance and violence of the Samson narrative appear to be sanctioned by the Lord. Though the story ends in a funeral, the tragedy has been transformed into a victory for Israel and her God. The operative theology behind such a reading is that despite the blood and the blunders, God is ready to use sinners to accomplish his divine will. Though the bar may be lowered for future sinners like you and I, these high expectations for Samson set by chapter 13 are quickly challenged as Samson sees a Philistine woman in Timnah and asks his parents to arrange a marriage. Good Israelites as they were, they pleaded with him to choose someone from among his own people. Running counter to the Deuteronomic prohibitions against intermarriage, the narrator intrudes into the story to provide the reader with this divine perspective. So his father and mother, Lo Yadu, did not know Ki me Adonai, he, that it was from the Lord. Ki to'ona hu mabakesh, for he was seeking a opportunity, mipilishtim, from the Philistines. Uva'et hahi, and at that time, the Philistines, moshalim be'Israel, were ruling over Israel. Samson's desire for foreign women, a reoccurring snare for Israel, is explained here as part of the plot and part of the Lord's plan. Many commentators note that the importance of the narrator's comment, saying things like, quote, "This is the key to this episode and indeed the entire Samson account, for it provides a theological explanation of Samson's escapades." End quote. There's much discussion around the issues of divine sovereignty and human agency, as well as how exactly the Lord's plan fits with what has been said elsewhere about foreign women. But these comments rarely factor into the interpretation of the narrative as a whole. Reading such commentaries, looking at English translations, or even looking at the BHQ, one could easily miss the philological and syntactical difficulties of this verse. What these translations and commentaries assume in interpreting Judges 14:4 is that what the Lord seeks is something that the Philistines would regard as negative. Judgment or vengeance becomes the underlying goal that animates God's willingness to work through a sinner like Samson. My goal tonight is to provide a different reading, which shifts the motive of the Lord and complicates the traditional understanding of Judges 14:4. I will argue that it is the Timnite woman that is from the Lord, and what the Lord seeks from the Philistines is something that will be for their ultimate good, namely that through this woman, the Lord would bring redemption. So where to begin? Well, there are three things that complicate this verse. First, the object that is from the Lord, he, is represented as a third feminine singular pronoun. As Hebrew does not have a neuter case, the pronoun could be an it, meaning Samson's desire and or situation. As the statement follows immediately from ki hi yashra be'ana, a case could be made for Samson's desire. This would, however, be an abstraction of yashra be'ana that ignores the object of Samson's desire. The pronoun could still be neuter while referring to the entire situation of verses 1 through 3, though this would equally be an abstraction. And as you can see, options A and B are the most common way of translating it. The pronoun could also be a she, meaning the Timnite woman. This is the clearest reference, for in verses 1 through 3, Isha is used 5 times and is qualified by benot 3 times. The problem here, in scare quotes, is resoundingly feminine. Why should the pronoun refer to something different than the Timnite woman that has been the object of conversation? It seems likely that the reader is meant to understand that this Timnite woman is from the Lord. The second ambiguity is the identity of the seeker, rendered as a masculine pronoun. Is it the Lord or Samson? Both are plausible from the grammar, but it is more likely that the Lord is the one seeking, based on the context of the narrator's intrusion. A third difficulty is that the object which the Lord seeks from the Philistines, to'ona, is a hapax legomenon. It is usually read as pretext, occasion, or opportunity. Most translations struggle to connect this word with mipilishtim. Some translations add an infinitive, so the NRSV has a pretext to act, or the NIV, an occasion to confront. Typically, the preposition min is translated as against in these versions, which is an unlikely meaning for the preposition. BDB reads ground of quarrel, which would fit well with mipilishtim, right? So he was seeking a ground of quarrel from the Philistines. The verbal root is apparently ana 3, which means to be opportune, meet, encounter opportunely. It is rare, occurring only 4 times. Out of these verses, only 2 Kings 5:7 provides a helpful analog. The king of Aram sends his servant Naaman to the king of Israel to be healed of his leprosy. The king of Israel responds, he knows I can't heal him. Just look and see how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me. Ki mithane hu li. The crucial difference here is the lamed preposition instead of the min. In the context of 2 Kings 5, the hithpael of ana 3 is idiomatic. A more literal rendering would be, for he is causing himself to meet me. Or in today's parlance, right, he is trying to get up all in my face. This idiomatic phrase is clear from the context, but one should be careful not to overstate the connection between the rare idiomatic usage of a verb and a hapax legomenon noun derived from apparently the same root. Unfortunately, I'll have to skip this section, but what is apparent from the ancient versions is the difficulty of this clause. Though there are differences, the unifying feature in these translations, and including the modern English ones, is that they all view this to'onah as engendering negative consequences for the Philistines. Perhaps the meaning of to'onah can be illumined by looking at nipakesh, the main verb of clause B. Is it normal for the Lord to bakesh? And if so, what does he typically seek? Of the 225 times that bakesh is used in the Hebrew Bible, only 11 of them have the God of Israel as their subject. I shall go through them very briefly and categorize them according to their objects. The first category is bakesh plus an infinitive construct, and it's pretty clear. God is seeking to kill or destroy. A second category has bakesh plus miyad. Now, there are three identical constructions in Ezekiel 3:18, 20, 33:8. V'demo miyadeka avikesh. But I will require the blood from their hands. The Lord is explaining the prophetic commitment. What he says must be communicated. If the prophet fails to proclaim what the Lord says and these people die in their iniquity, the prophet will bear the responsibility. The Lord will require the blood from their hand. An analogous logic is perhaps at play in Genesis 9:5-6, which expresses a similar requirement of blood from the hands that take life. This command has provided the legal basis for retributive justice, but it also provides a cultic logic. The spilled lifeblood needs a corresponding spilling of lifeblood. It is this blood equilibrium that needs to be rectified, whether it's by the one who spilled it, i.e. the murderer, or by a substitute. Refocusing on the passages in Ezekiel, we can see that the blood required by the Lord is symbolic of justice. The blood is on the hands of the prophet who does not declare the words of the Lord. The wicked will die in their sins, but God's judgment will fall on the prophet. Thus, this phrase means that the object the Lord will seek is related to justice. And a third category is bakesh with no object. It is likely an idiom related to the second category that has to do with judgment resulting in punishment or destruction. A final category is bakesh plus an object. Focusing on Ezekiel 22:30, the Lord seeks someone to stand in the breach, to turn away his wrath. Here, the author has included much more detail concerning the object of the Lord's seeking. First, it is a person rather than a thing. Secondly, the text describes the actions of the person. They will, 1, repair the wall, 2, stand in the breach before the Lord, and 3, they will do so on behalf of the land being Israel. Thirdly, the author explains the effect of their actions. They will avert the wrath of the Lord. And finally, the author describes the location of where the Lord will seek, mehem, which refers back to the people of the land in verse 29. Justice here is the fundamental issue. This person would rectify a broken situation, namely the corruption of the priesthood and the oppression of the poor. To summarize, by looking at the various objects and constructions of bakesh, we can readily see a recurring and unifying theme. The God of Israel seeks justice, which is accomplished in two ways, judgment and reconciliation, which is probably better thought of two sides of the same coin. In the first construction, bakesh plus an infinitive construct, it is clear that justice will come through the Lord's judgment. The second construction, bakesh plus miyad, is idiomatic. In 3 of the 4 cases, blood was the object being sought. This represented God's justice, both judgment against the wrongdoer and reconciliation, in that the blood equilibrium was symbolically restored. In the third construction, bakesh without an object, it was argued that the phrase was idiomatic of construction 2. The Lord would seek judgment. The fourth construction, bakesh plus an object, was quite different. It was not idiomatic, and it did not convey vengeance, punishment, or judgment. Instead, the object was a person. This person would either be an agent or a recipient of reconciliation. As an agent like David in 1 Samuel 13, the prophet priest in Ezekiel 22, or the godly offspring in Malachi 2, they would effect justice where there was injustice. The Lord's justice would be established through the faithfulness of his people. As a recipient, like the exiled and lost sheep of Israel, they would be the beneficiary of the Lord's actions in establishing justice and peace. From the available data, which category does Judges 14:4 belong to? It seems that construction 4 is the best option, as the clause contains an object. Thus, it is unlikely that the phrase suggests that the Lord is seeking judgment. It is similar to Ezekiel 22:30, as it describes the location, from the Philistines. Dissimilar to the other objects, or the other examples, the object does not seem to be a person. If the objects of the other examples were either the agents or the recipients of the Lord's reconciliatory justice, what does this mean for the To'onah in Judges 14:4? In this verse, the narrator has taken the reader behind the scenes. The perspective has shifted, and in effect, the audience can look not only behind the curtain, but into the very mind of God. Yet the difficulty is in the interpreting. Difficulties such as the hapax legomenon, its apparent rare root, the difficulty in fitting the verb and the noun and with the preposition, and the rare use of Israel's God being the subject of the verb bakesh should, at the very least, give the reader some pause. These difficulties, however, may allow the text to be read from other perspectives. One such reading may be that the To'onah that the Lord was seeking from the Philistines refers indirectly to a person. The feminine form may indicate that it is connected to the feminine pronoun in the clause before. The To'onah may refer to the Timnite woman, or at least an opportunity wherein she plays a pivotal role. She may be the agent or the recipient of reconciliation. There is, however, an apparent discrepancy between Judges 14 and other Deuteronomic prohibitions against marrying foreign women. The narrative intrusion perhaps reveals an ancient discomfort with Samson's choice. Marriage to foreign women, however, is not always condemned in Israel's scriptures. Moses, for instance, takes a wife from Cush. Rahab and Ruth are both foreigners who are incorporated into the people of Israel through their allegiance and worship to the Lord. The narrator's statement provides a counter-interpretation to the Deuteronomic perspective of Samson's parents, which reassures the reader that the woman is from the Lord. As it is also unlikely that the To'onah indicates judgment against the Philistines, perhaps then this Timnite woman will be an agent of God's salvation. Through her marriage to Samson, she may provide liberation for Israel, or even better, her whole people may encounter the God of Israel. Through this brief interjection and shift in perspective, the narrator has created certain expectations for the reader, namely that this foreign woman and Samson's marriage to her may become the epicenter for God's salvation. The beginning of the Samson narrative shares some resemblance to the strange story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. While most commentators make no connection, literary or otherwise, there is some precedence for it in the Talmud. These resonances invite the reader to compare the two seemingly disparate stories without making any comment as to intentionality or textual priority. And I apologize for the very pedantic slide here. The obvious link is that both narratives take place around Timnah. It is unlikely they represent the same town geographically or historically. Nonetheless, the name may be imaginatively suggestive in the reading of the Samson story. Other connections include the threat and danger of fire and the role of foreign women. Now, the key resonance between the two narratives is the theme of seeing. Just as Samson goes to Timnah and sees the woman who is right in his eyes, Judah is on his way to Timnah and he sees Tamar, who he mistakes to be a prostitute, sitting in the entrance to Enaim. Now, this place name is from Ain, meaning eye or spring, suggesting a settlement near a well. If so, it would signal what Robert Alter calls a betrothal type scene, or at least a variation of it that is common in the patriarchal narratives. Right before Tamar is about to be executed, she reveals the equivalent of Judah's underwear. Now, this is not blackmail, but a calculated risk. She has not given Judah an ultimatum, but given him a choice to recognize the objects. In another sense, Tamar has given him an opportunity to see her. Reading canonically, these literary features, the location of Timnah, the threat and reality of fiery death, and the protagonist's actions of seeing and desiring a foreign woman, strengthen the possible literary and theological connection between Genesis 38 and Judges 14. What do these connections point to? In Genesis 38, Judah moves from a deceptive and unjust father-in-law to a man who is deceived and administers justice. Judah sees Tamar and he proclaims, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." This interruption in the narrative presents the question, what is justice? The surprising answer is not found in the patriarchal and societal norms, but in Judah's response. Even in her deceptive harlotry, Tamar is more righteous than Judah. It was in this way that Tamar solidified herself as part of Israel. Justice in the narrative is characterized by reconciliation, not punishment. Tamar's execution is stayed, but even more, she is brought into the people of Israel. From the perspective of later history, Tamar would become a matriarch of the royal line of David and even of Jesus Christ. This type scene has been subverted here in Genesis. The woman at the well is not the promised wife of Abrahamic descent, like in the case of Rebekah. Instead, she is a foreigner who would nonetheless be instrumental in the formational history of God's chosen people. Returning to Judges 14, one notices more clearly the type scene. Samson goes down to Timnah and sees a foreign woman. Though his parents object to the marriage, the reader is given the divine perspective. Foreign or not, this woman was from the Lord, and through her, the Philistine oppression would end. Reading the scene through the canonical lens of Genesis 38 brings into question the prohibition against marrying foreign women. The last time the scene was set in Timnah, it was a foreign woman named Tamar that was declared more righteous than a son of Israel. It was through her that Judah's line would continue. Through this perspective shift in Judges 14:4, the reader's expectations have changed. They should be hopeful for what God has planned to do through this Philistine woman. Reconciliation, rather than judgment, may be the means by which God plans to save Israel. So to conclude, I have attempted to problematize the standard translation of Judges 14:4 by pointing out its ambiguities and philological difficulties. On the basis of my analysis, it seems preferable, at least to me, to reinstate the woman of Timnah as the he that is from the Lord and view the to'onah, the object of the Lord is seeking from the Philistines, as something positive that will end in reconciliation. The events that follow in Judges 14 and 15 reveal that Samson did not live up to these high expectations set for the reader. The woman from Timnah is murdered by the Philistines as a direct result of Samson's violent actions. If the vision of the Lord's salvation included the reconciliation of both Israel and the Philistines, then Samson does not appear to save anyone. The story that began at a wedding ends in a funeral, and in one sense is a tragedy. In another sense, the ability of this narrative to offer a different vision of how one might treat those regarded as other or as enemy may be part of its enduring quality as Jewish and Christian scripture. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon, for that really captivating presentation. And I think we're all in awe of your Prezi skills. I can speak for myself and say that's the first time I've ever seen it integrated into a presentation like that. But the quality of the presentation digitally was matched by the content and the substance that you gave to us. So thank you very much. Up next, we have Jennifer Lehmann. Jennifer is a PhD student at the Graduate Theological Union, and her paper is entitled Carnivalesque in Genesis 19, Hospitality and Reproduction in an Inverted World. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Trevor. Genesis 19 is marked by several inversions of expected social behavior. Guests are threatened with rape rather than welcomed, as is prescribed in Leviticus 19:33. Daughters are offered up to a mob rather than protected from prostitution, as Leviticus 19:29 commands. Guests are protect their hosts rather than vice versa, and daughters rape their father rather than honoring him, as in Exodus 20:12, or covering him when he's drunk, as in Genesis 9:23. This paper interprets Genesis 19 with the Bakhtinian concept of carnival by reading the events described as a carnivalesque and grotesque comedy. Reading Genesis 19 as a comedy allows us to take seriously both the threat of rape, which begins the chapter, and the actual rape, which marks its conclusion. Rather than reading the narrator's detached narration and lack of overt condemnation of both Lot's and his daughter's actions as an endorsement, reading the story as a comedy allows us to read with the text and see their actions as horrific acts in an inverted world. Once we see Genesis 19 as a literary carnival, it becomes clear that Lot is the carnival king, crowned at the beginning of the chapter by his sudden appearance as a principal character and decrowned at the end by his daughters. Viewing Lot as a comic figure and a carnival king, we can see more clearly the ways in which he's marked as an outsider from both the Sodomite and Israelite perspective. He's an outsider among his neighbors in Sodom, as the men at the door make clear. And though he is Abraham's nephew, he's outside the main family line on which this epic is focused and is distanced from Abraham both narratively and geographically. This outsider status is further emphasized at the end of the chapter through his connection to the Moabites and the Ammonites, both enemies of the Israelites. Most importantly, reading Lot as a carnival king places his sexual abuse at the climax of the story, forcing us to confront it as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. That is the propagation of the Moabites and the Ammonites. In this paper, I propose a reading of Genesis 19, which takes the entire chapter as a narrative unit. This is supported by the inclusio that's formed by the threat of sexual assault at the beginning of the chapter and the actualized sexual assault at its conclusion, and also by what I'll argue is the crowning and subsequent decrowning of the carnival king Lot. Bakhtin describes four main carnivalistic categories in his Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. The first is that carnival is a pageant without footlights. It makes no distinction between participant and spectator. Thus, carnival is not a performance, but something lived. And carnival is in some ways life turned inside out, or the reverse side of the world. Second, hierarchical structures are suspended, giving rise to free and familiar contact among people. This new mode of interrelationship between individuals also facilitates the organization of mass actions. Third, this is often embodied through the juxtaposition of opposites, which Bakhtin terms carnivalistic mésalliance. Part of this category is the theme of dualism, and thus paired images, whether chosen for their contrast or similarity, are common features of carnival. And fourth, flowing from the previous two categories is the profanation of the sacred and the elevation of the profane. These carnivalistic categories are embodied in what Bakhtin calls carnivalistic acts, the primary example of which is the crowning and subsequent decrowning of the carnival king. At the core of this act is a deep sense of ambivalence, because even the act of crowning contains within it the promise of decrowning. This ambivalence permeates the carnival. Throughout, and especially in the crowning and decrowning, is the pathos of shifts and changes, of death and renewal. As Bakhtin puts it, birth is fraught with death and death with new birth. The pathos of death and renewal and the ambivalence which characterizes carnival are what make it uniquely appropriate as a lens for the interpretation of Genesis 19. The character of Lot has troubled many scholars. He's saved from the destruction of Sodom, which implies that he's one of the righteous that Abraham refers to in 18:23. But his actions, primarily his disregard for the safety and dignity of his daughters, tell a different story. Consequently, there's disagreement on whether to characterize Lot as a righteous man, a bumbling fool, or a lecherous drunk. A carnivalesque reading embraces this ambivalence, as carnival and Syro-comic literature which it informs often combines opposing characteristics in the same character, such as the wise fool or the tragic clown. As we've already established, Genesis 19 contains several inversions of expected social behavior. Hospitality is inverted both because of the reaction of the men of Sodom to Lot's guests and the fact that Lot's guests are the ones who protect him. Paternal protection is inverted in Lot's offer to the mob to do what is right in your eyes to his virgin daughters. And finally, at the climax of the story, when the same daughters take advantage of an intoxicated Lot. Stuart Lassine's interpretation of the cannibal mothers in 2 Kings 6:24 through 33 and the Levite and his hosts in Judges 19 is particularly useful here. Lassine notices the myopic focus each character has on one object, which contributes to their inability to see the absurdity or horror of their own actions, and argues that these characteristics are what make them comic, but also show them to be characters living in an inverted world. This characteristic, which Bergson describes as inelasticity, absent-mindedness, or rigidity, is typical of comic characters and also highlights their likeness to a thing. Citing Bergson, Lassine argues that it is precisely the comic element of the cannibal mothers and the Levite and his hosts' behavior which highlights the inhumanity of their actions, and which our laughter attempts to correct. Where I differ from Lassine is in his claim that the Levite and his host are contrasted with Lot. I would argue that this rigidity is shared by Lot in his singular focus on protecting his guests, which leads him to offer up his own daughters to a hostile mob, and his daughters, whose focus on continuing the family line leads them to sexually assault their own father. The actions of Lot's daughters, in addition to being an inversion of expected filial piety, is an inversion of the callous way in which Lot treated their bodies and sexual agency. Just like the cannibal mothers and the Levite and his host, their comic myopia highlights the inhumanity of their actions and the inverted world in which they're operating. By offering up his daughters to the mob, Lot, because of his singular focus on his duty of hospitality, is also misinterpreting the intent of the mob. The men of Sodom are not driven by lust, but by hostility towards the foreign men who have come into their city. Thus, not only is Lot's offer a shocking and extreme response to this situation, it's an inappropriate and incongruous response to the mob's request. This is made clear by their response. And I quote, But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Not only do they reject Lot's offer without a thought, they also emphasize the real reason they've surrounded Lot's house, their hostility towards outsiders, through their reiteration of Lot's foreignness. Moving on to the suspension of hierarchy. This is most clearly displayed in the actions of Lot's daughters at the end of the chapter. While fathers are meant to control and protect their daughter's sexuality, by the end of the story, not only does Lot lose control over his daughter's sexual agency, his daughters take control of his. In the concluding verses of the chapter, Lot's daughters, as Bruce Fodder puts it mildly, treat in a singularly unfilial manner a father who had not exactly manifested to them the paternal ideal. Here, Fodder is highlighting the breakdown of a parent-child hierarchy, but the gender hierarchy is also broken down through their actions. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, with a few notable exceptions, women don't seem to have much sexual agency, let alone the desire or power to initiate sexual relations. And yet, more than simply initiating sex, these women dominate a man sexually, allowing him no sexual agency. The way in which this inversion of normative gender hierarchy emasculates Lot is obvious. But the sisters' claim that there is not a man on earth to come into us also suddenly hints at that Lot is already not a man. We also see a disregard for hierarchy in the mob's reaction to Lot's visitors. Not only are they disregarding the custom of guest right, they're threatening to assault and abuse angelic messengers. Further, as Bakhtin argues, the breakdown of social boundaries and hierarchies also facilitates the organization of mass group actions. The hyperbolic exaggeration with which the mob is described, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, reflects this aspect of Carnival. The insistence that all the men participated in the mob also reflects the pervasiveness of Carnival. No man is outside the performance of Carnival, each is both a spectator and a performer. That is, it seems, with the exception of Lot, who is the only man conspicuously not included in the mob. At the beginning of the chapter, it seems like Lot is juxtaposed with the men of Sodom and seems to be resisting the Carnival of Sodom. He offers to host the messengers that come into the city, and like Abraham in the previous chapter, he addresses them with deference and offers them shelter and feeds them. Most importantly, when the men of Sodom come to his door, he attempts to maintain etiquette and decorum by protecting his guests, in contrast to the men of Sodom who threaten to violate the guest right. However, Lot's response to the mob, as we discussed above, betrays his rigid focus on one object and changes our assessment of Lot. It's made clear that even he is part of the carnival. Even before this crucial moment, though Lot is compared favorably with Abraham in some ways, the two are also contrasted. As Lederler captures in the title of his book on the subject, Day in Mamre, Night in Sodom, the most striking contrast is the setting of the two episodes. While Abraham is visited in the day, sitting in front of his tent in Mamre, Lot is visited at night, sitting at the gates of the city of Sodom. Both the timing and the location of the episodes are different. Genesis 18 takes place in the daylight in the open, while Genesis 19 takes place in the evening in the midst of a city, as shadows are lengthening and masking those lurking in the alleys. Abraham is also juxtaposed with Lot's wife, as Lot's family is fleeing Sodom. Directly after Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt for looking back at Sodom, the narration skips forward to the next morning, showing Abraham looking down at Sodom, surveying the damage. And I quote, "Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord," in the episode that Richard spoke so eloquently about in his paper. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. The juxtaposition of Lot's wife's gaze and Abraham's gaze is tragically comic. While Lot's wife is immediately turned into a pillar of salt for looking back, Abraham is able to look down on the destruction without consequence, just as the roadrunner is able to run through a tunnel painted on the cliff, while Wile E. Coyote is flattened as he attempts the same thing. There's no obvious reason why one should be punished for the same action when the other isn't. Further, by directly referencing Abraham's conversation with God in Genesis 18, 23 through 33, and then showing the physical distance between Abraham and Lot, these two verses serve to remind us of Abraham's personal connection with God and also distances Abraham from Lot. And yet, Lot's connection with Abraham is not completely severed. In the next verse, the narrator gives us an interpretation of what has happened so far. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. While this verse isn't particularly flattering for Lot, as it emphasizes his lack of agency in his salvation, it also emphasizes his connection to Abraham. Even more complex than a juxtaposition of two characters is the juxtaposition of two aspects in one character, as we see with Lot. Lawrence Turner argues for this complexity in Lot's character in his article, Lot as Jekyll and Hyde. As we discussed earlier, Lot is introduced at the beginning of the chapter as a potential exception to the blanket characteristic of the people of Sodom as wicked. However, his reactions to the mob at the door is clearly wicked. Lot, it seems, is a contradiction. He's both righteous and wicked. However, this contrast serves a larger point. As Turner argues, Lot's character shows us that the moral world of Genesis is more complicated than Abraham assumes. When in chapter 18, Abraham asks God, "Will you indeed weigh the righteous with the wicked?" Even the characterization of Lot embraces the ambivalence of Carnival. Related to the juxtaposition of opposites is the pairing of two like things, a technique repeated over and over again in Genesis 19. In fact, the chapter opens with the phrase, Vayavo shnei hamalachim sadama ba'erev, and came two of the messengers to Sodom in the evening, making two the second word in the chapter. This is significant because these messengers are ostensibly the same messengers that visited Abraham in the previous chapter, and yet Abraham is visited by 3 men. 2 messengers come to the city. Lot has 2 daughters and 2 sons-in-law. In Genesis 19, the sacred and the profane are brought together under one roof when Lot offers to host the messengers/angels that come to investigate Sodom. It's true that the same messengers from God came to visit Abraham in the previous chapter, but the contrast between the sacred quality of the messengers and the profane nature of Lot is emphasized by the naming of these visitors as messengers, ha-malachim, in Genesis 19, rather than simply men, anashim, as they are in Genesis 18. This profanation is taken even further when the mob threatens to rape these angelic guests. More importantly, however, the carnival is not taken too far, as the messengers are able to prevent the carnival from leaving the square and invading the home. Further, Sodom itself is defined by its profanation of the sacred. In Genesis 18:20, God speaks of their grave sin. Lot cautions the men to not act so wickedly, and the outcry against Sodom is mentioned multiple times. It's unclear what the precise nature of their sin is, but it is clear that it has violated sacred codes, as it's displeasing to both God and his messengers. As we discussed above, the central element of carnival is the mock crowning and subsequent decrowning of the carnival king. In Genesis 19, which we've already seen to display many aspects of carnival, Lot is characterized as the carnival king, and his decrowning comes at the end of the chapter as his authority and manhood are stripped from him in an act of sexual abuse by his own daughters. Lot, as carnival king, is shown narratively through his sudden ascension from minor character to principal character in Genesis 19. Up until chapter 19, not only is Lot a relatively minor character in the Abraham cycle, he's progressively distanced from Abraham and moved to the peripherals of the narrative. He's introduced in chapter 11 as part of the descendants of Shem and is mentioned along Abram as being part of the group Terah brought with him out of Ur. But 2 chapters later, Lot is separated from Abram when he chooses to settle in Sodom, while Abram pitches his tent in Mamre. Larry R. Haler argues that Lot is introduced as a potential heir for Abram in chapter 11, and that the geographical separation of the two in the chapter 13 is significant in that it eliminates this possibility. And yet, at the start of Genesis 19, Lot is introduced as the main character of the story. Since Lot has already been eliminated as a potential heir, this sudden focus on Lot seems out of place, unless we read the story as a literary carnival. By reading Genesis 19 as carnival, we can understand Lot's sudden appearance as the principal character as his crowning. Throughout the chapter, then, Lot plays the lead by mimicking Abraham's actions in the previous chapter. And in a longer paper, I would go into more of the ways in which Lot mimics Abraham, but we don't have time to go into all of that right here. The sexual abuse of Lot by his daughters can be seen not only as his decrowning, but because it's the last we hear of Lot, it can also be read as his symbolic execution. He's stripped of his name and agency as soon as the sisters formulate their plot. After verse 30, Lot is no longer mentioned by name, nor is he the subject of any verbs. The decrowning of the carnival king is often accompanied by verbal and physical abuse, and thus, while his delaying and indecisiveness until now were subtle jabs at his character, his final decrowning and mock execution occur through this act of sexual violence. With this decrowning is made all the more humiliating by the fact that the act was perpetrated by women. However, Bakhtin argues all the symbolic aspects of this ceremonial of decrowning acquire a second and positive level of meaning. It is not naked absolute negation and destruction. Absolute negation, like absolute affirmation, is unknown to carnival. This is perfectly embodied in the birth of Lot's 2 sons as the result of his symbolic decrowning. The end of Genesis 19 is so ambivalent, it borders on paradoxical. At the macro level, the chapter begins with destruction and ends with birth. And at the micro level, Lot is emasculated by his status as a victim of sexual abuse, but at the same time, his manhood is reinforced by his fathering of 2 sons. The ambivalence of Carnival, the blending of death and renewal, the combination of praise and ridicule is the perfect vehicle for the origin story of Israel's most ambivalent neighbors, the Moabites and the Ammonites. While the story elicits laughter, Lot's status as an outsider is crucial here, as the reader wouldn't have been comfortable with such a depiction of Abraham, for example, as a victim of sexual abuse. Thus, Lot's decrowning is the final straw that completely eliminates Lot as a potential heir for the covenant. In fact, it completely eliminates him from the narrative altogether. However, Lot, and consequently the Moabites and the Ammonites, are not completely severed from the Abraham and his line. True to the ambivalence of the genre, Genesis 19 contains no absolute negation or absolute affirmation of Lot and his descendants. Much like the genre, this reading itself is ambivalent. It isn't entirely satisfying. It confronts both Lot's callous disregard for his daughter's safety and the sexual abuse that Lot experiences, but none of the characters emerge as the hero of the story. But that's because there is no hero in Carnival, as the crown of the Carnival king is only temporary. There is no need to make excuses for Lot's actions or the actions of his two daughters because their actions are inexcusable. They elicit both laughter and horror. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That was a really illuminating look at a really difficult text. And I know that I benefited from your exploration. I'll direct our presenters. There are questions funneling into the chat box, so you can prep yourself for our time of discussion at the end by looking at those. I'm sure that they'll be spoken to you when we move into our Q&A time. But for now, in our fourth and final presentation, we are thrilled to have John Darby. John is a PhD student at Nazarene Theological College and the University of Manchester. His paper is entitled, "Whose Blood is on the Writer's Robe? Revelation 1913 in Literary and Intertextual Perspective." John, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to present. I'll just try and share my screen now. Okay. Okay. To attempt to identify the source of the blood on the rider's garment in Revelation 19:13 is to address one small exegetical component of a much larger scholarly discussion concerning the interpretation of violent themes in the book of Revelation. None of the violent images employed in the apocalypse can be adequately appraised in isolation. They appear often as repeated elements throughout an intricately structured and stylized literary whole, and they are, to a large extent, products of an extensive web of intertextual relationships. Consideration of these formative intertextual relationships must include the multiplicity of themes, allusions, partial quotations, and images that are derived from the Hebrew Bible, as well as interaction with the traditions preserved in later Jewish apocalypses, such as 2 Baruch, 4 Ezra, and the parables of Enoch. The war scroll discovered at Qumran, 1 QM, dated just before the turn of the 1st century CE, also provides important material for comparison as an extended treatise on eschatological warfare, which combines earthly and heavenly dimensions. Even focusing on a single image, or rather combination of images, such as the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19, requires further delimitation of scope for a short paper such as this. For this reason, I have chosen only to deal with some of the more obvious features of intertextual and literary dependency that influence the interpretation of Revelation 19:13. In particular, I will consider the author's reuse of Isaiah 63, 1-6, and the relationship between Revelation 19, 11-16 and Revelation chapter 14. Scholarly debate around the interpretation of violent themes in the apocalypse is far-reaching and wide-ranging. But the following observations are offered as a contribution to an ongoing conversation typified by the work of two scholars in particular, Paul Middleton and Richard Bauckham. Middleton has published prolifically on the subject of martyrdom in early Christianity and the Book of Revelation, including the recent 2018 monograph, The Violence of the Lamb, Martyrs as Agents of Divine Judgment in the Book of Revelation, in which he argues that though Christian martyrs in John's constructed literary world follow the example of Christ, the proto-martyr, they are vindicated as a result and, quote, through their vindication, they share in the execution of divine judgment, and thus the martyr becomes, in the apocalypse, an agent of violent divine judgment. Christian martyrs in this sense offer their lives in self-sacrifice, but in doing so earn the right to subsequently exercise bloodthirsty retribution against their enemies. In each of these aspects, they are following the example of Christ, the proto-martyr and executor of violent judgment. It is this reading, supported by detailed argument throughout, that frames Middleton's interpretation of the White Rider in Revelation 19 as another Christophanic vision describing a moment in the narrative sequence of Revelation at which sufferer becomes torturer and martyr becomes agent of vengeance. Middleton's work responds in part to a number of interpreters who look to Revelation in some way as a model of non-violent resistance. Richard Bauckham in particular has contributed a great deal of exegetical supporting argument to non-violent readings of Revelation through his two books on the Apocalypse and a 1985 paper, The Book of Revelation as a Christian War Scroll. Middleton engages frequently with Bauckham, and one of the clearest points of departure between their interpretative strategies is illustrated by their treatment of the lion and lamb imagery in Revelation chapter 5. For Bauckham, the sequence of hearing, the traditionally militant description of verse 5, behold, the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome, and then seeing a lamb standing as if slain, constitutes a deliberate reinterpretation of militaristic messianic images in terms of suffering self-sacrifice. Christ and his followers conquer and overcome, but they do so not by means of military might and force of arms, but through faithful witness unto death. 12:11. Middleton criticizes this interpretation as reading an unnecessary incongruity between the two images and points to the apparently violent attributes and activities of the lamb. It has 7 horns, wages war, rules with an iron rod, and inflicts or oversees judgment, which includes, according to Middleton's reading, torture. He argues for an expressly sacrificial dimension to the lamb imagery, but reads martyrdom as a stage in a sequence which qualifies martyrs to subsequently operate as violent agents of divine judgment. The image in 19:11-16 of the White Rider, wielding a sword and clothed in a robe dipped in blood, leading armies dressed in white, is therefore interpreted by Middleton as another presentation of Christ and his martyrs, but this time riding in to exercise violent retribution described in verses 17-21. This paper addresses the question as to whether further exegetical consideration of this verse supports either of the two readings proposed or suggests alternative conclusions. I'll just read this passage, 19:11-16, my own translation. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and the one seated on it who is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war, and his eyes are like a flame of fire. And upon his head, which has a name written which no one knows except himself, are many crowns. And he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven were following him upon white horses, wearing linen white and pure. and from his mouth a sharp sword goes out, that he might strike the nations with it. And he will shepherd them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of the wine of the passion of the wrath of the all-powerful God. And on his robe and on his leg he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This sequence is full of language and imagery that is explicitly militaristic, judging and waging war, armies of riders and a sword. The armies dressed in white linen also echo the martial imagery of the 144,000 in chapter 14, who fulfill the requirements of purity for soldiers to be able to engage in active combat, 14:1 and 4-5, and also bear a divine name on their heads. Reiterating terms from the first 3 chapters of Revelation, the moniker faithful and true, eyes like a flame of fire, and the sharp sword protruding from the mouth all confirm the identity of the principal rider as Christ. See 1:14, 16, 2:12, 16, 18, and 3:14. Christ is portrayed in this scene using multiple images drawn directly from Isaiah 63, 1-6, including the blood-stained garments mentioned 5 times in Isaiah 63, 1-3, the treading of the winepress referred to 6 times in verses 1-6, and the anger and wrath of God in verse 6. In the Isaiah sequence, the blood which stains the garments is explicitly identified as the blood of God's enemies. Verse 6, I trod down the peoples in my anger and made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Several examples from the Targums show that this tradition continued to be drawn upon among various Jewish groups in subsequent centuries and long after John wrote his Apocalypse. 2 versions of fragmentary Targums on Genesis 49:11 speak of the King Messiah who goes out against those who hate him, kills kings and rulers, and reddens the mountains with the blood of their slain. Both versions refer to his garments either rolling in blood or being made clear, depending upon emendations to the Aramaic, and also refer to his cloak being whitened with the fat of their mighty ones. The Vatican manuscript version adds at the end of this sequence, and he is like one who presses grapes. These sources demonstrate that the images drawn upon in Revelation 19:11-16 of the blood-stained garment and the treading of the winepress were part of an attested tradition within wider Jewish circles that applied the language and concepts of Isaiah 63, 1-6 to the eschatological victory of the Messiah, and make it very clear that the blood staining the victor's garments and produced by the treading of the winepress was identified as the blood of his enemies, in continuity with the explicit sense of Isaiah 63. The question for our current purposes is, does the author of Revelation use these images in the same way? Or does he, as Borkham argues, deliberately reinterpret these traditionally militant themes, in effect repudiating apocalyptic militancy? To begin to answer this question, we must turn to the issue of literary context within Revelation itself, and in particular chapter 14, where the image of treading the winepress is first introduced. Middleton acknowledges that, quote, "It is not likely that the events of chapters 14 and 19 should be understood as separate events," end quote. At the beginning of chapter 14, we're introduced to the 144,000, who share certain characteristics with the rider and his armies in chapter 19. They bear divine names on their heads. They're described as chaste and ritually pure in verses 4 and 5, which parallel the garments of fine linen, white and pure in 19:14. And they follow the Lamb wherever he goes, 14:4. Both Borkham and Middleton identify the 144,000 in chapter 14 as an army of martyrs. It is notable that in the middle of the description of the ritual and moral purity of the martyrs in 14:4-5, we read that these have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb, NASB, emphasis mine. This is the language of both sacrifice and harvest. In the Hebrew scriptures, first fruits are mentioned 5 times with explicit reference to grain, dough, wheat, or flour. I've given you the references on the slide. 9 times without specification, first fruits of the soil, ground, or harvest in general. 4 times with the triple designation grain, new wine, and oil. And on 2 further occasions, the first fruits of grapes are mentioned. References to grain, dough, wheat, or flour do not discount grapes or new wine as a typical feature of the offering of first fruits. They merely emphasize the grain offering according to the purposes of their immediate contexts. Ezekiel 44:30 refers to first fruit offerings of every kind. When applied to the army of martyrs in the context of Revelation 14, the designation first fruits strongly suggests a reference to grapes and new wine, as we are about to read of the wine of the passion of the immorality of Babylon in verse 8, the wine of the passion of God in verse 10, the reaping of the ripe harvest of the earth in verses 15 and 16, the gathering of the clusters of ripe grapes from the vine of the earth in verses 18 and 19, and the treading of the great winepress of the passion of God in verses 19 and 20, which produces blood that came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles, verse 20. The most logical reading of the literary sequence in chapter 14 strongly suggests that the martyrs should be identified as the sacrificial first fruits of the grape harvest, which are reaped and then trodden in the winepress, producing a stream of blood which reached the height of the horses' bridles. The fate of God's enemies is described entirely differently. They are being tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, perhaps corresponding to the activity of the third angel introduced in verse 18, who has power over fire, rather than the first 2 angels who carry sickles for reaping, verses 14 to 17. Though these scenes present an entirely different challenge to non-violent readings of Revelation, which must be dealt with on another occasion, what appears clear is that the blood produced by the treading of the winepress is the blood of the martyrs, just as G.B. Caird had in fact suggested in his commentary back in 1966. And I'm skipping over now a section where I summarize some 11 or so additional supporting arguments that Caird gives for this reading. But all of them, he draws on shared early Christian traditions, use of the Hebrew Bible, and more literary analysis of chapter 14. But all of his arguments stem from that fundamental premise of the connection between the first fruits at the beginning of chapter 14 and the grape harvest and the treading of the winepress later in that same chapter. So I've summarized Caird's exegetical arguments. I'll read this part just to put in context their significance in terms of the conversation with Middleton. I've summarized Caird's exegetical arguments, none of which are explicitly addressed by Middleton when he dismisses Caird's reading of chapter 14. Although it must be acknowledged that throughout his monograph, Middleton deals with some of the interpretative themes reflected in Caird's position at considerable length. Caird's arguments are based on interpretation of imagery drawn from the Hebrew Bible, analogous early Christian traditions, and a literary analysis of chapter 14. In weighing this particular exegetical issue, Caird has advanced numerous compelling arguments which remain without detailed response or grounds for dismissal. These arguments stem principally from the same logical literary connection that I've highlighted above, the description of martyrs as first fruits and the grape harvest and trodden winepress. Chapter 19 then displays numerous direct literary connections to chapter 14, finding agreement among our interlocutors that it likely refers to the same event. When we are introduced to Christ as a white rider whose robe is dipped in blood, whose blood should we logically assume, therefore, that the author is referring to? In light of the context of chapter 14, the blood on the rider's robe is the blood of the martyrs. For this reason, when considering the blood on the rider's robe as an example of the kind of martial imagery typically employed in the Apocalypse, in this particular instance, we should conclude that Borkham's approach, which reads John as deliberately inverting or reinterpreting violent imagery from the Hebrew scriptures and contemporary messianic traditions, in this case Isaiah 63, 1-6, should be preferred to the interpretation of Middleton and others who identify the blood as that of Christ's conquered enemies. As I signaled at the beginning of my paper, this constitutes only a small piece of a very large exegetical puzzle concerning the interpretation of violent themes in Revelation. Nevertheless, in this specific instance, it is my conclusion that a fresh examination of the blood on the rider's robe in Revelation 19 contributes towards a reading of Revelation that understands it to be reinterpreting traditionally violent and militaristic themes in order to effectively invert them, resulting in a literary and theological repudiation of militaristic violence. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, for dealing with a really rich and often perplexing text. I want to say thank you once again to all of our presenters for some phenomenal papers. And now the part that, in addition to your presentations that I think many of us have been looking forward to, which is getting to pick your brains and talk through some of the theses that you've presented to us. We're now going to have about 30 minutes set aside for questions and discussions. If you have a question, I would encourage you to indicate that in the chat, because I'm not sure who was here and who is still here at this present moment. Even if you have put a question in before, I'd love for you to indicate in the chat with the simple sentence, I have a question, or even I have a question for a certain presenter. That will permit me to call on individuals in a somewhat orderly fashion, at which point we'll let you unmute yourself and address your question to a presenter. Remember, it will be really helpful to clearly address one or all of our participants with your question, and I would encourage you to keep your questions brief. I will get us kicked off with a question that recurred multiple times in our chat box for Dr. Middleton. Hebrews 11:17-19 offers what seems to be an unequivocally positive reading of the offering of Isaac as an act of faith, and James 2:21-23 discusses Abraham being justified by works when he offered Isaac on the altar. Could you speak to how those New Testament texts, how you would read those New Testament texts? Do they problematize your thesis? Do they not? And what role do New Testament texts like that play in a project like yours of seeking to exegete freshly the Old Testament?
So at various points in my book, I have a footnote commenting on these texts because I assume they will come up. They come up from me. But there wasn't really a structural place in the argument to do this. I thought of having appendices to the book addressing questions like this, but it would make the book too long, and the publisher said it's long enough already. So I couldn't write any more, but I'll do some blog posts on the Baker Academic Book site, I think, about questions like this. So, Hebrews 11:17-19, particularly, Abraham is praised in different parts of Hebrews 11, but there he's praised for the Aqedah, for his offering of Isaac, with the claim that he believed in the resurrection, that God could have brought Isaac back from the dead. and that God did in a certain way do that. Okay. So there are two ways to respond to that. And I'll get to the other one, the James 2 passage in a moment. Two ways to respond. The first way is saying, okay, just think about this. This New Testament text praises Abraham for the offering of Isaac. Did you notice that in verse 32, it praises Samson and Jephthah also as heroes of faith? So this illustrates what James Kugel calls the Bible as it was. In the first century, the Common Era, the Bible is being read from a particular lens, where you have those that are valorized and those that are demonized, basically the good guys and the bad guys. And it's an interpretive midrashic lens through which the Bible is being read. It's not exegesis. So that's the first thing to say. So I'm trying to exegesis. So even the James passage is fascinating. The James passage mixes Genesis 15, where Abraham is declared righteous by God because he trusted in like the stars, your descendants will be. But then it blends that with he's declared righteous, he's justified because he offered Isaac obediently. But James's point is that he is justified by works. And the chapter 15 passage is a justification passage. The works passage is the offering of Isaac. He did something to show his faith. But I read this also through the lens of this is a midrashic reading of a later text. And there's a famous statement in the title of one of Richard Hayes' books, Reading Backwards, which I think is a bit of a misnomer because Hayes doesn't actually read backwards most of the time. He actually reads forwards. And I'm proposing a book later on with a publisher called Reading Forwards. I'm looking at particular case studies of how the Old Testament is used in the New. And I don't think you can first go to the New Testament and say, this is what the text is interpreted to mean. Therefore, we read it back into the Old Testament. Rather, I want to ask, what does the text say in its original context? How, through a history of interpretation and tradition, do we get to the New Testament so we can understand why they say what they're saying? So I want to keep them separate from the history of interpretation is not the same as exegesis. That's my quick answer to that.
Thank you. Remember, if you have a question for a presenter, to go ahead and indicate that so that I'm not left scrolling up 2 hours ago into our chat box to find your question. I'm going to go now to Bobby, who submitted a question for Jennifer. Bobby, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, go right ahead.
Hi, thanks. And thank you all for such interesting talks. Thank you, Jennifer. So here's my question. One of your claims is that the sexual assault of Lot can be read in this story as being inherently valuable as an end in itself. But I wonder, is it the sexual assault of Lot, or is it the shaming and the decrowning of Lot? That's the end of the story, the goal of the story. And if it's the latter, why do you think it is through sexual assault in particular that this decrowning occurs? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what I'm trying to do with this paper is part of a larger project that I'm working on, which is highlighting male victims of sexual abuse in the Hebrew Bible. And Lot is the most obvious, and I'm reacting especially to scholarship that have glossed over that bit of the end of Genesis 19 and see that the Lot's daughters sleeping with Lot as a means to producing heirs. Whereas my reading reads Lot's sexual assault as the climax. Lot's sexual assault is the decrowning. But your question is really great because there is also the question of whether decrowning is an end in itself or a means to bringing us out of carnival and back into the real world. And so I think that's part of your question. The other part was why it's specifically sexual assault. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's part of my greater project, which I found a lot more male victims of sexual assault than I expected to. And so look out for that. Hopefully I'll be publishing something about that soon.
Thanks, Jennifer. Shoban, you have a question for Brandon?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brandon. My question is whether you could say a little bit more about the gender dynamics that you alluded to, because I think your reading offers a different kind of take to the idea that, you know, women are the downfall.
Yes, thanks, Siobhan. Yes, so I think first off is that the story, whether we would wish that there was a different story or anything like that, the story is still Samson's story. He is the protagonist. So obviously all the other characters that are all minor characters in the story are all in relationship to Samson. We may wish there was a different story, but that's the story we got. So in light of that, there are significant moments within the narrative that where the narrator, the storyteller, shifts the perspective. And a few times, the one we looked at was Judges 14:4, which gives us the Lord's perspective. But there's a few times where we're given the perspective of, you know, his mother and father. But we're also given the perspective of the Timnite woman when she is at the wedding and the Philistines are being like, you know, tell us the answer to the riddle or we'll kill you. You know, Samson doesn't know, well, it doesn't look like Samson knows that, but we as the reader know that. And we're given the woman's perspective there. We're also given Delilah's perspective. We're given other people's perspectives, which I think really adds to this characterization of Samson, is that the reader knows more than the characters of the story. So with the gender dynamics, I think, you know, contrary to the pretty typical reading is that, you know, women is the downfall of man, and especially with Samson. I think that there's more at play in the story. And I think this verse, Judges 14:4, actually really launches that point off where we go, oh, actually this woman, and maybe after she dies, obviously, maybe the other woman, the sex worker at Gaza and Delilah, maybe we're supposed to, as the reader, expect positive things from these women. And ultimately, it's Samson's own actions that ruin all of these things, not necessarily the woman's actions to him. But thank you for your question. Hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now we'll move to a question from Simon for John.
Thanks, John. Fascinating paper. Really, really interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to check if I'd understood really, because I may have missed this, but it seemed to me that you were suggesting that the first fruits, who are the 144,000, are the first fruits of the grape harvest, which is obviously, you know, as you rightly said, the harvest of judgment. I'd kind of read it that they were the first fruits of the grain harvest, which is the kind of the ingathering of the nations. So the first fruits become the positive ingathering harvest. So could you say a little bit more about the relationship between the grain harvest and the grape harvest and how they fit together with the first fruits?
Yes, thank you very much. Brilliant question. So I'm reading, I am indeed reading them as the first fruits of the grape harvest, and judgment obviously is a big word in terms of the connotations and tricky ones to unpack, but essentially I'm reading it as I suppose you could say positive harvest. I'm reading it as the grape harvest, which stands for the ingathering of the elect, the ingathering of the martyrs. So it's the first fruits of the grape harvest, but it is the grape harvest. It is the harvesting, the reaping of the martyrs, the faithful, the elect, the righteous. And the reason I read it as the grape harvest as opposed to the grain harvest is because I don't see any. I mean, you know, I think my examples from the Hebrew Bible were kind of just supposed to illustrate that the first fruits can be all of those things, and are all of those things. But in terms of chapter 14 of Revelation, I don't see any positive indication or nothing to do with the grain harvest explicitly. Obviously, that doesn't mean it couldn't be, but the whole chapter is about grapes. You've got the first fruits are introduced, and then straight away the wine of the passion is being drunk, and then straight away after that you move on to the sickle and the reaping, and then straight away you move on to the winepress and the treading of the winepress. So it's the literary sequence and all the symbolism that's being used throughout the chapter, except for the torment of fire for the wicked, which again, that's the point of contrast. The grapes is the righteous. The juice produced by the grapes is the blood of the martyrs. The consequence for the oppressors is having to drink the consequences of what they've done, i.e. what's produced by the death of the martyrs. So it's there's an equivalence there to the consequence. Yeah, have I answered the question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to go back and look at this again, because that's completely the other way around to the way I'd interpreted it when I did some work on this. So thank you. You're certainly sending me scurrying back to the text to have a closer look at it. I mean, in terms of the Hebrew Bible background, I would be tending to look to something like Joel 3:13 with the two harvests. And just to push back very slightly before shutting up, I mean, you say the whole passage, the whole chapter is about the grain harvest, except the grape harvest, except it isn't, of course. It's got the grain harvest right there in the middle of it as well. So that is in there.
So where's the grain harvest?
Verses kind of 14 to 16.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm reading as the grape harvest. So I don't see the 14 to 16 as the grain harvest. I see that as the grapes.
Okay. Fine. Maybe we talk outside of this, but that was I'd really like to engage any more on this. So thank you so much.
Can I do a very quick comment? Okay, super quick is just to say the Son of Man connection and the harvest connection seems to be very consistently used through the Gospels and New Testament to do with the ingathering of the elect, or the harvest in a positive sense of believers. As opposed to a kind of a negative judgment sense.
I'll say Simon's phrase, sent us scurrying back to the text, I think could be said for each of the presentations we've had, and that is not a bad result. Up next, we'll have Joe with a question for Richard. Is Joe here?
I'm Georgina with a question for Richard, but I don't know who the Joe might be.
There was a Joe Playfoot. Okay. Well,
that particular question will come into my answer to one of the other questions if I get to that. Many of them are tied together.
Okay, the question that Joe presented on Genesis 22:8.
So we can hold that for a moment to get Georgina's question.
Okay, perfect. Georgina, take it away.
Okay, Richard, thank you so much. I found your presentation of Isaac's disappearance compelling, and it just brought me to think about the way that the servant of Abraham addresses God, or at least conceptualizes God in his prayer, and whether you think this is perhaps already intimating kind of a universalism beyond the Toledot and the patriarchs.
When you say universalism, are you saying something different than what you put in your comment that I read about just a different point?
No, I'm perhaps extending already on that. Okay. So please do address that point.
So I think there's a sense in which Genesis is about a universalism, because you can look at the primeval history in relation to the ancestral history in two different ways, at least. You can say the ancestral history is prelude, the real story is a story of Abraham and the people of Israel. Or you can say, as Genesis Rabbah says, why didn't God create Abraham first? Because he's so righteous. Why God created Adam, and if he sins, God will tell Abraham to set it right. So you can look at the general story is the story of universalism. God wants a relationship with all the nations. When that goes wrong, he chooses Abraham and his descendants to restore that relationship in some way. So there is an implicit universalism. But the verse that you quoted in 24:27 is in the prayer of Abraham's servant. He blesses God who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. Which the question you asked is very interesting. I'm going to actually now maybe put a footnote in my book because of this question. I love this. So did Abraham at least pass on to his servant something about God's mercy, even if not to his son, because his son he diverged later on? And I think that's interesting because I hinted at the end of my paper that there was one praiseworthy action of Abraham, the fact that he offered the ram. In fact, a number of commentaries point out correctly, God did not instruct the offering of the ram. God just said, don't offer your son. He looked up and behold, that is what, a ram? Which also, by the way, tells you he wasn't looking for a substitute before. So this is the point about that Joe's question. Where's the sacrifice? Says Isaac, and Abraham says, God will provide the sacrifice, my son. With God, he's not looking for an actual sacrifice different from his son. Immediately he goes to sacrifice him. It's after the angel calls it off. He sees a ram, and he, I think, on his own initiative, goes to sacrifice the ram because he understood God didn't want to sacrifice his child. So maybe that's the positive thing that gets passed on. In fact, just because we critique Abraham doesn't mean that God has given up on Abraham. Because the angel swears an oath, by myself I have sworn, and because you've done this thing, usually interpreted to mean because you obeyed me, I'm going to swear an oath to back up all my promises. But I think it's opposite. I think because you couldn't rise to the challenge, I'm going to have to do this by my own oath. I will support the promises. Chapter 18 said that you would pass it on. No, I will have to pass it on in some sense. The shift that you get from at the golden calf between a conditional covenant in chapter 20 and an unconditional covenant in chapter 34 is the same thing here. Abraham was supposed to do something to allow the covenant promises to be fulfilled according to chapter 15 and 18. He couldn't do it, so God says, I will do it myself. It's an act of grace. And maybe the servant learned that.
Yeah. Could I push a little further, perhaps, to suggest that might the test have been, as you suggested, a test of love where Abraham might have offered himself in the place of his son.
Yes, there's that too. There's that too,
yeah. Thank you so much.
This is a text that, as Auerbach put it, is fraught with background, but there's very little externalized description up front. So you have to speculate about what's going on beneath the text in the characters. And we don't know, so we have to hold those ideas very loosely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Erica, you have a question for Jennifer?
Yes, hi, thank you. Jennifer, I loved your Bakhtinian reading, and I wanted to know if you wanted to make some comments about the connections or possible connections between the story of Lot and his two daughters and Genesis 9 with Noah and his son Ham.
So yeah, there are a lot of and a lot of people have made connections between those two stories. One of the things that I would like to point out is that while Noah plants a vineyard and drinks the wine, Lot is specifically not narrated as drinking wine himself. His daughters feed him wine, which points to sexual assault, and which is why I argue that the sexual assault is something that is not only in the text that we as modern readers can read, but something that the narrator is trying to get the reader to see. It's that's one of the contrasts between the two. And I think it's really interesting that even though there is that contrast, the Noah story has been read as sexual abuse, whereas Lot's story is hardly ever read as a rape narrative. So I think the sexual assault of Noah is a possible reading, but I don't think it's not nearly as obvious as the Lot story, which is why it's very confusing to me that scholars haven't picked up on it. Not only not picked up on it, but actually like gloss over Lot's sexual assault.
And can I just add? I mean, I think I was curious more about the carnivalistic reading of Lot as the uncrowned, the foolish king. Do you see that can extend to other narratives? I mean, can that extend to some extent to the Noah narrative? I guess that was more where I was trying to ask.
Yeah, I actually hadn't really thought of Noah as a carnival king necessarily, especially because he's kind of groomed as a main character from his birth. But I think there is definitely a potential to read that. Do a Bakhtinian reading of that chapter. Although in response to your question of whether there are other chapters that I've thought of to interpret that way, I think the story of Judah and Tamar is there's Genesis 19 calls back to Genesis 9, but also foreshadows Genesis 34, I think. It's a very those chapters are more similar, I think. They're both kind of weird interludes where a character that we know but like don't really care about comes to the forefront and then experiences sexual assault. I also interpret Tamar's actions as sexual abuse.
And also, and I guess Tamar has been seen as an interlude to the Joseph cycle as well, where Joseph is also then confronted. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Jennifer, very briefly, do you have thoughts about, because it's showing up in the chat box, do you have thoughts about juxtaposing Genesis 6:4 with the account in Genesis 19, where the sons of God come to the daughters of men just before the introduction of the Noah narrative?
Yeah, I saw that earlier and I hadn't thought about that at all. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about that I hadn't really thought about before. I definitely have to think about that a bit more.
I think it stuck out to some people because the way that you described the relationship between the men of Sodom and the angels, it sort of perked up a couple ears, I think, as resonant with the way Genesis 6 narrates that action. I'm going to open it up to Helen with a question for Brandon.
Thank you. So, Brandon, I'm interested in. Oh, thank you so much. I've been puzzling over that verse for years, and I've been determined that it didn't mean what it looks like it means, and I couldn't crack it. So, I'm indebted to you. I suppose I'm left with the question of what the angel says to Samson's mother. In chapter 13 somewhere, and also what is going on at the end of Samson's life when he prays to God, and then obviously we all know what happens. Is that God answering Samson's prayer, and if so, how does that kind of fit with what you're setting out?
Yes, thank you, Helen. As probably all these papers are small slivers of much larger projects. So yeah, I can't answer all those questions. 13:5. I think most people, when they read this, at least some of the more kind of negative readers of 13:5, which says the Lord, and he will raise up a son, he'll be a Nazarite, blah blah blah, and he will begin to save Israel from the hands of Philistines. People normally take the begin part as this negative foreshadowing. I don't think that's accurate, because the Lord also says, in Joshua, it's like, in Joshua, I will begin to elevate you in the eyes of, so there's no negative foreshadowing there. So I don't think there's negative foreshadowing in 13. I think it's all positive, elevating those high expectations for the reader, which then only become, souped up by the narrator's very strong intrusion into the narrative. Now, because the narrator is content with intruding into his own story, I mean, this is like, if we were watching a film, this would be like the freeze frame voiceover kind of, of the director, right? So that's how it sounds, and how it works in the Hebrew. So we know that the narrator is content to do that. Later in the story, Samson cries out to God because he's thirsty, and God is content to provide him with water. And there's some interesting things there, but there's but the narrator is content to tell you what God does, and then he's content to tell you. But Samson's thought, but the Lord, he did not know that the Lord had left him when his hair is cut and the Philistines are upon him. So the narrator is very content to tell you what God is thinking, what God is doing, and what Samson is unaware of, right? So we're aware of that, but Samson's not. But when it comes to the prayer, when he pulls down, we just hear that Samson prays, and there's silence. The narrator does not tell you that God showed up, that he was strengthened. There's no Ruach Adonai coming in. There's nothing like that. It's just silent. And at other points in the narrative, Samson is pretty content, or pretty good at being strong in his own power and doing things in his own strength. So I don't think we can definitively say, I don't think the key to understanding the characterization of Samson in the narrative comes from looking at exactly where God is and isn't present. But I think it is something, but I think it's underdetermined in the narrative. So I am a larger thing. I would go other directions, but I think that is a good question.
Thanks, Brandon. And we will hop over to Kiersey with a question for Jennifer.
Hello, Jennifer, thank you so much for your very wonderful paper. I have just been working on a lot for a couple of months here now, so it's kind of like coming out of my ears at this point. I do trauma theology, so I come from a completely different angle. But because of that, I did wonder that in this kind of more kind of carnivalistic reading of the passage, which I can absolutely follow throughout the story, no issue with that at all. I just wonder, because my point of focus is the daughters of Lot, that's how in your reading you then understand the daughters in their kind of reasoning of what's happening. Are they then just stupid or something, or what's kind of going on? Is that something we're meant to just laugh about?
So yeah, I think I wouldn't describe the daughters as stupid. I think they're so there's something really interesting about what the older daughter says to the younger daughter, which is usually translated as, there is no man in the land or the world to come into us. The interesting thing about that, in the Hebrew, she uses a weird preposition that's not usually, so the verb lavo is used often to mean a sexual, used to have a sexual connotation very often. But it's usually with the preposition el, which means to. She uses the preposition al, ayin lamed, which has like more of a like upon or onto kind of valence. So which is kind of weird. And the use of lavo and al is used elsewhere to mean an attack. And specifically in Genesis 38, I think it's Genesis 38, the rape of Dinah, it's used when the sons of Jacob come upon the city. It's used twice. And I think at least in one of those occasions, it is referring to sexual assault, because they come upon, after they kill all the men, they come upon the city again. So that leads me to think that I don't entirely want to say that she is saying there's no man in the land to rape us. But the language that she used does have that, does kind of imply that. And I think maybe it's a Freudian slip, because that is her experience with sex. That is how she is that's her, the way that she has experienced sex, because of that's how her father has, kind of willy-nilly thrown her virginity out to the mobs. So in that way, I think while I want to emphasize Lot as a victim here, I definitely don't want to say that the daughters are not victims, even in the actions in verses 33 through 38, because they have a very warped view of the world because of their trauma that happens earlier in the chapter.
Yeah, great, thank you. This is really interesting. Thank you.
We're running a bit short on time, but Erica, you have a question for Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also, Dr. Middleton, thank you so much for your paper. I've heard kind of a lot about different views of the story, but great presentation. My question that arose was when you said that there was a priority for trusting in God, that trusting in God requires discernment and knowledge about who God is over a blind faith. And I just keep thinking of that in terms of the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Genesis narrative, which I've been talking about with someone as a kind of testing, wondering if that was also a kind of testing from God. And I just wondered if you had thought about that, because there is that same kind of theme of seeking knowledge and discernment versus following in blindly without assertive will. And I don't know.
Well, so I think in Genesis 2 and 3, it's a little different. So I do have a reading of the text. I read a couple of articles on it, but there's a book coming in a few years. Not my next book, the one after, on Genesis 2 and 3, a theological reading. The way I've viewed is this, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not permanently off limits. It is off limits for the time being. Because knowing good and evil, or knowledge of good and evil, either the verb or the noun, throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, only half a dozen occurrences are all positive. They're all something you need as a mature adult. And so it seems to me that the original creatures of God are treated as children, or to simply trust God, so it's a kind of a blind obedience, till the time when they can attain the knowledge of good and evil. But for a child to make decisions about good and evil too early sears the conscience. And so I read the text through that kind of a lens. So it's a little different.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
Well, it looks like we have reached the end of our allotted time. I think it is late in the UK and it is late afternoon here in the United States. I, for one, am still buzzing with questions, not least Genesis 19 as a carnival, Passover, and Exodus that founds the Moabites and Ammonites. So fortunately, I have everyone's email addresses, so you can expect me to be in touch with my questions in the near future. Let me remind you, the CSBV conference continues each day this week with sessions beginning at 7 p.m. BST. Let me also point you to the other activities of the center, including the blog on the website, which has a newly minted preaching element. There's the Guns and God podcast, and the newly established Journal for the Study of Bible and Violence. So any way you like to get your material on biblical violence, the CSBV has something for you. Also, if you're interested in donating to the work of the center, you can visit the website at csbvbristol.org.uk and find all the information that you need quite easily about contributing. Let's give one final round of applause to each of our participants today. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another session.